On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers roared off the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, their engine straining against the wind. It was the first time in history that land-based bombers had ever launched from a carrier, and it was a desperate gamble. America was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese empire stretched from the Pacific to Burma, and the US needed a message, not just for the enemy, but for itself. Leading the raid was a man with nerves of steel and a mind made for chaos, Lieutenant Colonel James Harold "Jimmy" Doolittle. A racing pilot, a scientist, a stuntman, and a soldier, Doolittle was all of these things and more. He had broken airspeed records, invented new flight instruments, and earned a doctorate from MIT. Yet here he was, standing on a heaving deck, about to take 16 twin-engine bombers into the heart of Japan. The plan was audacious, maybe suicidal. Take off from the Hornet, bomb Tokyo and other industrial targets, and then continue west to land in free China. There was no way to return to the carrier. Each crew knew that after dropping their bombs, they'd be running out of fuel over enemy territory. It wasn't a mission to come back from. It was a mission to prove a point. At dawn, the fleet was spotted by Japanese patrol boats, hours before they were supposed to launch. Doolittle made the decision instantly: launch now or lose everything. The wind howled. The ocean bucked. The runway was barely long enough. But Doolittle's voice came calm and clear over the radio: let's go. He was the first to take off. His bomber, tail number 40 to 2344, thundered down the deck, nose dipping dangerously toward the waves. For a second, the aircraft seemed doomed, then the lift caught, and it rose, clearing the carrier by inches. 15 more followed, one after another, each carrying 4 bombs and the weight of a nation's morale. Hours later, the Japanese mainland appeared beneath them, cities sprawling in peacetime order, unaware that war was about to arrive overhead. Doolittle guided his bomber toward Tokyo, flying low enough to see rooftops, trams, and startled civilians. At 12:25 p.m., the bomb bays opened. Explosions rippled across Tokyo's industrial districts, oil depots, factories, shipyards. The Doolittle Raid had begun. The damage was light compared to later bombings, but the psychological shock was enormous. Tokyo had been considered untouchable. Now American bombers were flying over the emperor's palace. Panic swept through Japan's military leadership. For America, it was a spark of hope, proof that the enemy could bleed. But the triumph came with a cost. The bombers had launched early, far from their intended range. None had enough fuel to reach safe territory. Doolittle's crew pressed west, through storm and darkness, hoping to find the coast of China. The engine sputtered. Gauges dropped to 0. One by one, crews made their decisions: bail out or crash. Land. At 9:20 p.m., Doolittle's plane ran out of fuel over the mountains of Zhejiang province. He ordered his men to jump. They parachuted into blackness, into wind and rain. Doolittle landed hard, tumbling through a field and rolling into the mud. He lay there for a moment, stunned but alive. His bomber lay wrecked miles away. He was rescued by Chinese farmers who risked their lives to hide him from Japanese patrols. In the days that followed, Doolittle learned that most of his crews had survived, though 8 men had been captured and 3 executed. The Japanese response was brutal. Entire villages suspected of helping the Americans were burned to the ground, thousands killed in reprisal. Doolittle carried that knowledge like a wound for the rest of his life. When he finally returned to the US, he expected to be court-martialed. "I thought I'd lost my command, my crew, and my career," he later said. But instead, he was met with parades, medals, and the roar of a nation that finally had something to cheer for. President Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor, calling him a master of calculated risk. But Doolittle didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor, and survival, to him, was never enough. After the Doolittle Raid, Jimmy Doolittle could have retired as a national hero. He had already done the impossible. The Medal of Honor hung around his neck, his name was in newspapers across the world. But for Doolittle, the war wasn't over, not until the skies themselves were safe. In 1942, he was sent to North Africa to command the newly formed 12th Air Force, a rough, under-equipped, untested force fighting its way through the chaos of Operation Torch. What he found there was confusion, units scattered, radios silent, planes grounded for lack of parts. Doolittle's solution wasn't speeches, it was presence. He walked the flight lines, climbed into cockpits, and talked to mechanics, gunners, and rookies. He was the kind of general who smelled like oil and gunpowder, not perfume and politics. He told his pilots, "I don't expect you to be perfect. I expect you to be relentless." And relentless they became. Under his command, the 12th Air Force hammered Axis airfields in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. Doolittle led from the front, literally. He often flew the first mission of a campaign himself. Once, he took off in a P-38 Lightning just to see the target from the pilot's perspective before sending his men into combat. But his old luck with the ground never changed. In North Africa, his transport crashed on landing, again. He walked away bruised, bleeding, and furious at himself. The press joked that Doolittle didn't so much fly as fall successfully. But the truth was darker. Every crash reminded him of China, of the crewmen who hadn't made it home. It drove him harder, made him colder. In 1943, Doolittle was promoted again, this time to lead the 15th Air Force, flying from bases in Italy. His pilots faced the most dangerous skies in Europe, long-range missions over Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. The Luftwaffe was desperate but deadly, and the bombers paid the price. Entire formations vanished over targets like Ploiesti and Regensburg. Doolittle visited the crews the night before their missions, not to inspire them, but to look them in the eye. "We're going to lose men," he would say, "but we're going to win the war." It wasn't bravado. It was a promise. Then, in early 1944, he was given his final, greatest command, the 8th Air Force, the largest aerial strike force in history. From bases in England, he would lead tens of thousands of men and machines in a new kind of war, total air dominance over Europe. At that time, American bombers still flew under strict formation tactics. They were escorted by fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, but those planes had limited range. When the escorts turned back, the bombers were left alone over Germany, easy prey for the Luftwaffe. The losses were catastrophic. Doolittle changed everything. He tore up the rulebook. He ordered his new escort fighters, the long-range P-51 Mustangs, not to fly tight around the bombers, but to hunt the enemy wherever they found him. Critics said it was madness. Doolittle said it was evolution. And he was right. Within weeks, German fighter losses skyrocketed. The Luftwaffe's elite squadrons were shredded in the skies over Berlin and Leipzig. Doolittle's gamble, just like the one over Tokyo, had worked again. He wasn't done risking himself, either. During a mission briefing one morning, a young pilot asked, "Sir, when's the last time you flew a mission yourself?" Doolittle smiled, climbed into a Mustang, and joined the sortie that afternoon. When he returned, his plane was riddled with holes. "Now you've got your answer," he told the pilot. The crashes didn't stop, either. In England, he wrecked a B-26 Marauder during a test flight, walking away from the wreckage with a broken rib and a grin. His men started calling him the general who can't stay grounded. But what truly defined him wasn't the crashes, it was what he did after each one. He always got up. Always climbed back in. Always flew again. In late 1944, when Allied bombers began striking the heart of Germany day after day, Doolittle refused to delegate the hard decisions. He approved missions in blizzards, through flak, over fire. His men cursed his orders but trusted his instincts. They knew that somewhere up there, behind the mask of a general, was still the same pilot who had once leapt into the dark over China, alone. By 1944, the war had entered its most merciless phase, a storm of metal and fire that stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the frozen ruins of the Ardennes. Above it all roared the American bombers, B-17s and B-24s, thousands of them, engines droning like a plague over Hitler's empire. And leading them, in spirit and in strategy, was Jimmy Doolittle. The Doolittle who had once risked everything on a single raid over Tokyo was now orchestrating entire armadas, over 100,000 men under his command, each of them betting their lives on his decisions. But even for him, the skies over Europe exacted a terrible cost. The 8th Air Force lost more men than the entire US Marine Corps. Every mission briefing was followed by silence, that unspoken ritual of checking who didn't come back. Doolittle felt it deeply. He kept their names, handwritten, in a notebook he never showed anyone. At night, in his quarters at High Wycombe, he would read the day's losses, light a cigarette, and stare at the map, the web of red pins creeping steadily toward Berlin. Each pin was victory, and each victory was paid in blood. He had built the most powerful air force in the world, but he had also built a machine that consumed lives by the thousands. And though he never admitted it aloud, it haunted him. When officers questioned the morality of carpet-bombing German cities, Doolittle answered coldly, "End the war faster. Save more lives in the end." But sometimes, when he spoke those words, he didn't quite believe them. In February 1945, his airmen launched Operation Thunderclap, a series of massive bombing raids meant to break German morale and cripple rail lines feeding the Eastern Front. The target was Dresden, a city of art and history, a city much like Paris. What followed was a firestorm so intense that it burned the oxygen from the air. Tens of thousands died in a single night. Doolittle didn't give the order directly, but it happened under his command. For the rest of his life, he would never speak publicly about Dresden. Still, he pressed on. The war demanded it. As the Allies advanced into Germany, Doolittle's fighters swept the skies clean of resistance. Luftwaffe aces who had once terrorized Europe were now flying in desperation, their fuel nearly gone, their bases bombed to rubble. In one of his rare moments of reflection, Doolittle told a young pilot, "You're not fighting men anymore. You're fighting ghosts." By April, the war in Europe was nearly over. On April 29th, Doolittle received word that Hitler was dead. The same day, his squadrons flew their final missions over a shattered Germany. When the radio crackled with the announcement of unconditional surrender, Doolittle didn't cheer. He simply sat down, exhaled, and said, "It's finished." But the war had taken something from him, something he would never quite get back. The man who had once seen flying as pure freedom now saw it as the most disciplined form of destruction ever invented. He had led from the cockpit, survived crash after crash, carried the weight of thousands of dead men, and still flown again. When the newsreels rolled, they called him the hero of 2 air wars. When reporters asked him how he wanted to be remembered, he said, "As a pilot who did his job. Nothing more. Nothing less." But those who served under him knew better. They knew he wasn't just a commander, he was a symbol of the war's brutal balance, genius and gamble, courage and consequence, flight and fall. Even after the war, Doolittle kept flying. He tested jets, studied supersonic flight, and watched the world he had helped build move into a new atomic age. And every time he climbed into a cockpit, he carried with him the same lesson that had kept him alive from Tokyo to Tunisia to Berlin, that resilience isn't the absence of fear or failure. It's the will to rise from the wreckage and try again. Because Jimmy Doolittle didn't just survive the war. He defined what it meant to endure one. When the guns finally went silent in 1945, the world turned to rebuilding cities, nations, and souls. But for men like Jimmy Doolittle, there was no peace, only transition. He had spent his life in motion, a blur of engines, orders, and explosions, and now, in the stillness of peacetime, he didn't quite know how to land. The medals came first. The parades. The handshakes. The reporters asking about the Doolittle Raid, the great gamble that had awakened a sleeping giant. He smiled for the cameras, saluted the crowds, and thanked his men. But inside, he felt detached, as if the man they were celebrating had existed in another lifetime, one lived entirely above the clouds. When asked what he thought of the atomic bomb, he paused and said, "I wish we'd never had to find out." It wasn't a politician's answer, it was the weariness of someone who had seen the price of victory too closely. After retiring from active duty, Doolittle didn't fade into obscurity. He became one of the architects of the modern age of flight, studying high-speed aerodynamics, advising on the birth of the jet engine, and predicting the arrival of space travel. The boy who had once raced cars through the dust of California was now helping design the machines that would pierce the stratosphere. But no matter how far technology advanced, he never lost the pilot's sense of humility before the sky. "You never conquer it," he said once, looking out at the horizon. "You only borrow a little of its time." In the years after the war, Doolittle grew close to the families of his fallen men. He wrote letters to mothers, widows, and sons. He visited cemeteries quietly, without ceremony. At one service, he told a grieving mother, "Your boy was one of mine. And I was one of his." He refused to glorify combat. When Hollywood came calling, he agreed to advise on films about the Doolittle Raid, but only if they portrayed the fear and uncertainty honestly. "War isn't courage," he told one director. "It's endurance." By the 1950s, Doolittle had become more than a war hero. He was a living bridge between eras. He had flown fabric-wing biplanes and metal-skinned bombers, propeller fighters, and early jets. He'd seen the sky go from dream to battlefield to frontier. Few men in history ever flew so high or fell so hard and still came back for more. In 1989, at 92 years old, Doolittle stood before a crowd at the Air Force Academy. His voice was thin but clear as he told a new generation of pilots, "If you're afraid of failure, you'll never fly. If you stop after falling, you'll never rise. Courage is persistence, not perfection." They rose and saluted him, not because of his medals, but because of what he represented, the unbreakable will to continue when everything else has crashed. Jimmy Doolittle lived long enough to see the dawn of stealth bombers and space shuttles, to watch the sky he had once fought for turn into humanity's next great frontier. When he passed away in 1993, his ashes were buried at Arlington. Among those who had flown with him and those who had never returned, his epitaph was simple: "Just as he wanted, James H. Doolittle, pilot." But to history, he was something more. He was proof that the sky belongs not to those who never fall, but to those who keep flying after they do. Because some men are born to walk the earth, and others, like Jimmy Doolittle, are born to rise from it, again and again, no matter the cost. Long after the last bomb fell and the last dogfight ended, Jimmy Doolittle's shadow still streaked across the clouds. The jet age had dawned, sleek, cold, unstoppable, but every pilot who throttled forward into that roaring new sky carried something of him. His philosophy had become doctrine. His courage had become legend. By the 1950s, flight was no longer a dare, it was a science. Supersonic speeds, guided missiles, radar, and spaceflight had transformed the sky into an empire of machines. But Doolittle's fingerprints were on it all. His wartime strategies, decentralizing command, empowering pilots, blending precision with improvisation, became the DNA of modern air warfare. His belief that a commander should understand what his men faced inspired a generation of fighter leaders who flew beside their squadrons, not above them. He often said, "A leader should never ask his men to do what he hasn't done himself." And he proved it over and over, in the cockpit, in the crash, in the climb back up. As the Cold War set in, he watched a new kind of fear rise, one that couldn't be fought with bullets or bravery. The sky he had once ruled now shimmered with nuclear threat, satellites, and silence. But Doolittle didn't despair. He saw it as another frontier, another chapter in humanity's long struggle between innovation and destruction. He once wrote, "The tools may change, but the spirit must not." That spirit, the refusal to yield, the will to try again after the fall, became his true legacy. When the first astronauts walked on the moon in 1969, reporters asked Doolittle what he thought. He smiled faintly and said, "They made it farther than any of us ever dreamed. But they got there by learning to fall and fly the hard way." In his twilight years, Doolittle spent less time talking about the war and more about the people who lived through it, the mechanics, the nurses, the ground crews, the ones who never made headlines but kept the sky alive. He understood better than anyone that no victory is won alone. And as the century turned, the roar of jet engines over distant deserts and oceans still carried the echoes of his doctrine, speed, precision, audacity. The tools had changed, but the fire was the same because Jimmy Doolittle's story wasn't just about flying, it was about falling forward. About turning failure into flight. About what it means to lead when the only way out is through the storm. Even now, when historians speak of him, they talk about the raid, the medals, the machines. But the real story, the one whispered in hangars and flight schools, is simpler, that when the world was falling apart, one man kept climbing. And in doing so, he taught humanity something timeless, that courage is not in never crashing. It's in standing up, wiping the blood and oil from your face, and saying, let's go again. Because as long as there are skies, as long as there are men and women willing to rise into them, Jimmy Doolittle will never truly land.